Hello and welcome to Himalayan Dialogue. Today we have invited Mr. Shiva Tiwari in our program. Mr. Tiwari has done Masters in International Relations from South Asian University. He is Managing Editor of Nepali Journal of Contemporary Studies. Mr. Tiwari also writes on various newspapers covering domestic politics and foreign policy issues. Tiwari ji, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. I feel very much delighted for you have invited me to this Himalayan Dialogue series.
At first, I would like to ask you a very straightforward question. Does Nepal have a foreign policy? What do you think?
Many intellectuals and scholars within Nepal and outside of Nepal sometimes say that Nepal does not have foreign policy. It generally has, reactive tactics towards what other international actors do when it comes to their behavior in Nepal. For example, one renowned international law scholar, Professor Surya Subedi, he has said, he has said that generally foreign policy is defined as foreign policy is said to be an extension of domestic policy or public policy. But in case of Nepal, according to Subedi, just the other way is true. Nepal's, many times Nepal's domestic political situations or domestic policies are influenced by what international actors or external actors do to Nepal. We should not be saying that Nepal does not have foreign policy, because Nepal is one of the oldest nation state in South Asia. It is the oldest nation state. So it has Nepal as a nation state dates back to more than 200 years ago, and it has thrived in what is popularly called in international politics an anarchic world order. Nepal has been able to protects its sovereignty. It has been able to remain as an independent nation even in heydays of colonialism, when our neighbor India was occupied by Britain. So from that time onwards until now, we have inherited or we have protected our sovereignty. Means in one way or the other we have got a foreign policy. It would be unfair to say that Nepal does not have foreign policy at all.
Nepal has a history of more than 200 years and it is one of the oldest nation state in the world. So how do you differentiate different phases in Nepal's history in terms of foreign policy making?
In this question, I think I should not go before the time of unification of Nepal. At that time, I think we should say that Prithvinarayan Saha, from Prithvinarayan Saha towards 1951, 2007 Bikram Samvat, when democracy was established in Nepal. I think Nepal's foreign policy was quite effective. This assessment becomes a bit higher level of abstraction or analysis, but I think Nepal at that time had a glorious history, imperial history. It had not only spread its territory in the east and in the west, but it had to maintain its dominance as far as Sikkim, Tibet. It had been such. After and with coming of British, with occupation of India by British colonial ruler, there was serious, repercussions in conduct of our foreign policy, because all of a sudden this imperial powerful kingdom was had to be defensive in front of very mighty British rulers in India. But even at that time, especially after coming of Rana prime ministers or Rana rule, they had judiciously and wisely they had protected our sovereignty, and they had prevented Nepal from becoming this part of British India Empire. In that sense, we should say that our foreign policy was effective. And largely, even until now, the roots of our foreign policy, I think, lies on what we had at that period of time. We have certain sense of nationality. We have a certain sense of bravery. We have certain sense of independence, and I think our the roots of our independence can be traced back to that period of time. That imperial, Nepal. After establishment of democracy, Nepal remained a divided house at that time. And Nepal's foreign policy conduct went to, I think, a defensive posture.
You think pre 1950 Nepal was better than post 1950 Nepal in terms of making a foreign policy?
Um, I would not exactly say this because before 1950, mode of organization of politics, not only in Nepal but the whole world, was different. Okay, those were the times of racial politics in the world. I do not support, and no, I think nobody supports the mode of social and political organization before 1950.
No, I want to focus you on making a foreign policy. So, pre 1950, there is a preconceived notion that Nepal was in an isolation. So, most of the Western scholar or even Indian scholar, they argue that Nepal was in isolation. Nepal was never in contact with other countries in that period of time. But you argued that that was one of the glorious period in Nepal's history. So, the imperial Nepal or imperial Gorkha period was glorious period in Nepal's history. So, are you challenging the preconceived notion?
Okay. What I mean is, sometimes we have to use history as a source of our foreign policy as well. Some people have gone to the extent of challenging everything that happened during, including unification by Prithvi Narayan Saha, isn't it? My opinion is that, until 1950, Nepal had a type of imperial history. So imperialism is no more considered a good, isn't it? It doesn't bring glory to nation states until now. But why should not we be proud of that history? Isn't it? I do not mean that, those were the times of glory. Foreign policy at that time was, a very good one. We should follow that. At that time, making a foreign policy was relatively easier. First, Nepal was isolated from the outside world. Second, the rulers, the people who got chance to make foreign policy, or the people who made foreign policy, were limited, and making a foreign policy and executing a foreign policy was within the hand of very limited number of rulers and their supporters. General people did not have say in domestic politics and in making a foreign politics and execution of foreign policy. At this time, we have many political actors. We have relations with many states in the world. We have become member of many international organizations. We have bilateral relations with, I think, more than 100 states of the world. So in this time, we can make a robust and viable foreign policy if and only if it is knowledge based, and if there is a strong institutional mechanism to make foreign policy. We should not be living in nostalgia of that time, and it's not possible.
When Panchayat system was established in 1960, so during that period, how these institutions, different institutions like Tiwari universities, different institutions within Tiwari University, ministries and the palace, how were they coordinating with each other?
During Panchayati era, some people have nostalgia about conduct of foreign policy during Panchayati era, and they go to say that university institutions were very good. That is partly true. In terms of foreign policy, I think we have to credit Panchayati era. During Panchayati era, it's true that sometimes foreign ministry was said to be just an arm of palace, and university and research centers in universities such as Shinas, they worked in the interest of that prevalent regime of monarchy at that time. So it was quite clear but narrow, at that time. So foreign ministry would not do what was against kings, monarchs' interests, or regime's interests. And many scholars have said that at that time our national interests were defined as interest of the monarchy, monarchical regime at that time. You know, so and universities, they produced knowledge, not extensive. The researches did not happen extensively, but they were sufficient to you know to give intellectual support to this narrowly defined national interest, which was, as I said you previously, was the interest of the regime. Okay, so some people have nostalgia towards that, but our foreign policy should we should not be we should not take foreign policy in isolation, because our foreign policy should have brought economic benefit to the people. It should have brought development to the people. It should have been able to bring open discourses as they have been happening at present, but it did not happen. So in terms of diversification of foreign policy, in terms of establishment of bilateral relationship, in terms of Nepal's international legal personality or international personality, Panchayati era contributed. But in terms of domestic front, which was necessary to buttress an effective foreign policy, Panchayati regime was a failure. We should not be we should not be advocating a Panchayati regime for what it did in economic fronts or domestic politics or empowerment of general people or allocation of values to the people in domestic front. But on foreign policy front, it did, because it was partly understandable, because at that time ruling elites, even for the sake of even for the sake of their prestige in international politics, it was necessary, mandatory for them to have one sort of international image, and it was possible for them because at that time, the rule was authoritarian, partyless, and a Cold War era political, world politics had enabled them to continue with that type of, incoherent domestic and foreign policy.
And during that period, like, whether palace worked as an institution or king as a personality matter much?
King was just a part of institution of monarchy. But if you read about instigation inside the palaces, or what happened to King, massacre during King Birendra and all, and if you see the conflicts that were within the palace, you cannot say that King was much. King could run the politics individually, or at his will, or in consultation with the people who had informed opinion. His the king had to conduct politics based on various forces or various interest groups within the palace. So it was not, I think, solely the king who conducted politics, domestic politics, or foreign policy at that time. There were various forces within the palace, not within the state, within the palace itself, who limited or who enabled the king to act in a way he acted.
King Birendra was king during Panchayat period, and even after Panchayat period, he proposed Nepal as a zone of peace. So, how do you see king's role in pre-1990 period and post-1990 period?
Zone of peace that was brought forth by King in time of King Birendra. I think this was one of the most original aspect of Nepal's foreign policy. Nepal, I think, has not been able to construct its own narrative or discourse in conduct of its foreign policy until now, except for this zone of peace policy.
You considered zone of peace proposal as a homegrown proposal. So after 1990, is there any substitute to that proposal? Or how our institutions are working to substitute that proposal with some other homegrown proposal?
I think I did not say it was a homegrown narrative or discourse of foreign policy. Most probably, it was influenced by. My reading is that it was influenced by vocabulary and concepts of non-aligned movement and 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. But interestingly, what I see is zone of peace. I think was only the policy was a policy in which Nepal had been able to construct its own narrative in the history. Sometimes I see zone of peace as something original to our foreign policy.
Post 1990 period, it was not only change in Nepal. Even the global scenario was changed. It was the post Cold War era. Did we frame our policy differently, and how we operate, or how do we operate now, or how did we operate in that period?
1990 has been a benchmark in terms of changes in international politics and in Nepal's politics, as we discussed earlier. The time demanded that we had to develop institutions or mechanisms to address those challenges that we would be facing. With economic liberalization, with globalization, with what has been called explosion of knowledge or media or information superhighway. This has changed the very nature of the state. From now you have to address the concerns from the below. It has largely made political relationship in what we call vertical to horizontal. It has empowered the people. But what I have seen is where our country is lagging is, in my opinion, state has lagged the mechanisms, institutions, and knowledge formations that is required to address these challenges we are facing now. For example, like in every other part of the world, our minorities have been demanding for rights, isn't it? And now, the discourse of identity has been largely led by non-governmental organizations in Nepal, and state has just shown reactions to what these discourses have been doing. This is very unfortunate. Our institutions have failed to be leader in shaping the discourses that is necessary for the state, and this applies to foreign policy as well. This is unfortunate and dangerous. We need very proactive foreign policy. Until now, it has been a bit passive, status quoist, and we have been consuming whatever other people have been doing, other actors have been doing. We are most probably limited to reactions in front of stimulus that other external actors have given us.
Foreign policy cannot be defined only in terms of survival or a strategy for survival. Now we have to address various concerns of people living, downtrodden people, or the well-being of those peoples, inviting foreign investment. Defense is always there, but there are some other priorities also. So how are different departments of our government or of our state, for example, different ministries, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Industry, how are they coordinating with each other in making of foreign policy? Do you see there is any coordination?
In 21st century, our foreign policy cannot be like it used to happen in the past, like it used to be during authoritarian regime or colonial era or something like that. It's true. As you said, now no more our state, our national interest, our execution of foreign policy can be there to please a certain set of rulers or regimes or authoritarian rulers. Now we are in a democratic setup, and our foreign policy has to focus on many things. First, it has to focus on bringing economic well-being to the people. It has to focus on value allocation of downtrodden people, who culturally, socially marginalized, politically marginalized people. It has to focus on bringing national glory to the nation, and it has to also ultimately focus on bringing some prestige to the ruling class. After all, they are the people who devise the foreign policy. So, foreign policy now has got many challenges. Execution of foreign policy, especially in our context, has got many challenges. And as you said, a vibrant foreign policy, an effective foreign policy, and a robust foreign policy has to be a combination of, as you said, these mechanisms that coordinates different organs of the state. Keeping these things in mind, all these are organs of the state. For example, Ministry of Home Affairs and Finance Ministry, and then you have our Defense Ministry. Foreign policy making bodies, or in making a foreign policy, all these organs of the state have to be consulted. Through my experience, what I have found is, I had done some small researches about it. Through my researches, I have found that there is coordination between these institutions on ad hoc basis and on timely basis, because they have felt that coordination is necessary. But strong, theoretical or knowledge-based interaction, or a permanent type of mechanism that forces foreign policy making bodies to interact with this has not been formed yet.
So, why is this the case? What are the problems you see in this case?
To this, these people have got one ready-made answer: the lack of resources. Let me remind you, recently I wrote one article about why good libraries are not there in Nepal. And when I asked people, it is due to lack of resources. But my finding was, it is not lack of resources. It is lack of willpower. My hunch is that, lack of resources is not appropriate answer. The answer, I think, is lack of willpower. There is a type of vicious circle here. The vicious circle is politicians, they are afraid of people who produce knowledge, and intellectuals, most of the intellectuals, because of strong institutions, because of lack of strong institutions of knowledge productions, either they have to submit to what politicians say, or they don't get appropriate platform to exercise their intellectual ability, and they don't get institutions for their growth. And politicians, they have paid lip service. They have said, we want to make knowledge-based institutions. But when it comes to establishing institutions, they again go to recruiting, let's say, quote unquote, recruiting their loyals who hardly dare to speak against what politicians who want to listen. There is a type of conformity, and there is open politicization of institutions, universities, and think tanks, where intellectual work, production of quality intellectual works is not, there is no structure to reward intellectuality as such. This should have been replaced by a virtuous cycle, wherein politician would have faith on intellectuals. Intellectual would go on building institutions. These institutions would reward intellectuals, and then the knowledge produced in these institutions would lead to betterment of our politics and policies. But very unfortunate, very sad to say, after restoration of democracy, there has been tendency to go towards conformity, and this has hampered not only politicians or intellectuals, but society as a whole. And if we talk about foreign policy, also, effective foreign policies, robust foreign policy that combines theories, models, and pragmatic execution, and evaluation and strategies required for all this. There is a seriously lacking of a vibrant mechanisms for this process, I think.
There is not only government in democracy. There are non-governmental organizations as well. How do you see the role of non-government organizations? And how are they giving input to the government?
Some NGOs and INGOs, for that matter, they have been doing research in Nepal. I do not want to undermine the researches they have done, or suggestions they have given, or discourses they have created. But it is unfortunate that government has just to be reactive in the discourses they have produced.
Are you trying to say that those NGOs are becoming lobby groups?
It would be very difficult for me to explain these things exactly in one sentence or so. So what has happened is, these NGOs and INGOs, they have been doing researches, but and for this they have been receiving fund from generally from international agencies, and they have to show to continue with the fund they are getting from international agencies. They have to show that their work is genuine. It addresses some problems in this society. And sometimes they tend to tend to amplify the problem, because amplification of the problem or existence of problem is receiving of the fund is contingent upon remaining of these problems in the society. So I don't know whether they have become lobbyists or leader in shaping of the discourses. Sometimes they might have become leader, not only lobbyist.
Finally, what would be your suggestions to those institutions or to those actors who are involved in making of policy, especially foreign policy and or policy in general?
As I just quoted earlier, in that article about library, I had said that because of lack of resources, we have not been able to do this. Expenditure in research, expenditure in promotion of universities, expenditure in promotion of proactive academic environment would not be waste of resources. I think it would, in long run, it would be a source of further accumulating or collecting resources itself. So I think for this, we need to have vibrant academic institutions, think tanks, and media that is very sensitive towards social political discourse in the country, and politicians need to have faith on knowledge. Knowledge might not be solution to everything. In international politics, there are other sources of power. Military power might be necessary, but for weak countries like ours, may it be for survival, may it be for having prestige in international scenario, for our maintaining our sovereignty, for well-being of the people, or for independence, which might be interlinked. All these issues might be interlinked with each other. I think we have to go for knowledge-based policies, and for that matter, we need to have very vibrant academic institutions, think tanks. I think this is this is what I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Tiwari, for coming.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
You are watching Himalayan Dialogue. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share our videos. Please provide your feedbacks in the comment section below. Thank you.